In the dim light of Seattle gymnasium, where the air hung heavy with the scent of sweat and iron, a towering bodybuilder of 320 pounds issued a challenge to Bruce Lee. Within 10 seconds, the giant found himself on the ground. His bravado dissolved into silence, as if the encounter had been predestined from the moment their eyes met. Big Jim did not seek Bruce Lee out. That would have required admitting the other man mattered enough to pursue. Instead, he allowed the current of the gym to carry the moment toward him. He was 33 that year, born in Tacoma to a longshoreman father and a mother who worked nights at Boeing. By 18, he had already been lifting seriously for 4 years, first in a makeshift garage setup with his older brothers, then at the YMCA downtown, where the equipment was older than he was. Powerlifting came first. Squat, bench, deadlift. Numbers that could be written down, compared, improved upon. Bodybuilding followed later, after he realized the shape of muscle mattered much as the weight it could move. He competed regionally, Mr. Northwest, a few. Smaller IFBB qualifiers, never placing high enough for a pro card, but always placing. His physique spoke clearly. Thick traps that rose toward his ears, arms that measured 22 inches cold, a barrel chest that made button down. Shirts impossible. When he walked through the gym doors, conversation dipped. For a beat, the way it does when something large enters a small space. Jim trained in the late afternoons, after the day shift at the Port of Seattle. He favored the same. Corner of the weight room every day. The power rack nearest the windows, where he could see Elliott Bay if he turned his head. His workouts followed a rhythm that never varied much. Warm-up sets building to working sets, rest periods. Measured by slow breaths rather than a stopwatch. He spoke little during sets. Between them he answered questions when asked, gave spot when needed, nodded at, compliments without smiling. His reputation rested on consistency rather than bravado. The stories about Lee reached him gradually, the way smoke drifts under a closed door. At first they were fragments overheard in the locker room, a student saying Lee had demonstrated a 1-inch punch that lifted a 200-pound man off his feet, another claiming Lee could kick higher and faster than anyone they had seen, yet never seemed to lose balance. Jim listened without comment. He had heard similar claims before about karate black belts who could break boards, judo, instructors who could throw anyone, boxers who swore they could knock out a bull. Most of it dissolved under pressure. What made Lee different was the absence of performance. The man did not demonstrate for crowds. He did not challenge anyone publicly. He trained, taught, left. His students spoke of him with quiet certainty that Jim found more irritating than loud boasting would have been. They did not argue. They simply stated facts as they saw them. That Lee's power came from structure rather than size, that his speed was not flash but economy, that a correctly placed strike could end matters before the other man understood he had been hit. One Tuesday in March, Jim finished a heavy bench session, 4 plates and a quarter each side for sets of 5, and sat on the end of the bench wiping his face. A younger lifter, maybe 22, approached with the hesitant energy of someone carrying news. "You see that Chinese guy on the mat today?" the kid asked. Jim nodded once. He had this big dude, must have been 240, try to grab him. Just gone, like the guy tripped over nothing. Jim folded the towel. Slowly. Tripped. Yeah, Lee barely moved. Just turned his hips or something. Guy went down hard. Jim stood, racked his plates with the same deliberate motion he always used. Interesting. The kid waited for more. When nothing came, he drifted away. That was how it began, not with anger, not with a dare, but with a slow accumulation of small accounts that began to feel personal. Jim had spent 15 years building a body that could not be moved easily. He had trained through injuries, through plateaus, through winters when the gym felt colder inside than out. The idea that technique alone could negate that work did not offend him so much as puzzle him. It contradicted the physics he understood, Mass times acceleration equals force. If Lee truly possessed superior acceleration, fine. But if the difference in mass was large enough, acceleration became irrelevant. A week later, during a slow Saturday morning when the gym was half empty, Jim walked over to the edge of the mat area. Lee was there, working with 3 students on trapping. Hands, close-range redirection drills. The movements were small, contained, almost invisible from 20 feet away. Jim stood with his arms crossed, watching for perhaps 2 minutes. Lee glanced over once, met his eyes briefly, gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement, then returned to the lesson. Jim did not speak. He simply watched until the session ended, then turned and walked back to the weights. Word moved faster after that. By the following week, the gym had divided itself without anyone declaring sides. The bodybuilder stayed near the iron, casting occasional looks toward the mats. A few of Lee's students began arriving earlier, lingering longer. Conversations in the locker room grew pointed, but still indirect. Think he'd last 10. Second against Big Jim? 10 second would be generous. Guy's fast, though. Speed don't matter when you're getting crushed. No one said these things within earshot of either man. Yet everyone knew the question had been asked. Jim did not issue a formal challenge. That would have been crude, theatrical. Instead, he began training closer to the mat area, moving his rack 1 station nearer each week, a slow migration that no one could accuse of being deliberate. He increased the weight on his lifts, just enough that the clank of plates carried farther. When Lee entered the gym, Jim would pause mid-set, watch for a moment, then continue. One afternoon in early April, as rain tapped the windows like fingers, Lee finished a solo session on the mat, footwork patterns that ended in sudden shifts of direction, and walked toward the water fountain near the weights. Jim was on the bench press. Mid-set, he finished the rep, sat up, and spoke the first time directly to the smaller man. You ever feel like testing that against real weight? Lee paused, cup halfway to his mouth. His expression remained calm, almost polite. Real weight? He asked. Jim gestured toward his own chest with an open hand. This kind. Lee considered the offer for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he set the cup down. If it becomes necessary, he said. He bowed slightly, not deeply, just enough to close the sentence, and walked away. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. No one else heard it. But by the end of the week, the gym knew. The collision had been scheduled, not by date, not by time, but by mutual recognition that neither man could walk away from the question forever. The air in the gym thickened after that. Sets were finished with a little more focus. Conversations grew quieter. Everyone waited for the moment when words would no longer be enough. The gym never announced anything. It simply shifted. By mid-April, the change was perceptible to anyone who spent more than an hour inside the brick building. On East Union, sets that once ended with casual laughter now finished in near silence. Men lingered longer at the water fountain, towels draped over shoulders, eyes flicking toward the mat area, even when no one was training. There, the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz a little louder. The rain against the windows sounded more deliberate. Word had not spread through newspapers or radio. It moved the way things moved in 1970s Seattle. Gyms, from one bench to the next, from locker room mirrors to the steam room, carried in half sentences and raised eyebrows. A powerlifter finishing. Deadlifts would mutter to his training partner. You hear what Big Jim said to the Chinaman? The partner would nod without looking up, then carry the fragment to the next rack. Within 48 hours, the entire regular crowd knew the outline of the exchange, even if the exact words varied slightly, depending on who was retelling it. Lee's students felt the shift most acutely. They arrived in small groups now, 2 or 3 at a time, rather than straggling and alone. They spoke less during warm-ups. Their drills grew tighter, more focused. When they practiced, Chi saw the sticky hands. Sensitivity exercise. They kept their voices low, as though volume might invite interruption. One of them, a lanky university student named Mark, who had been training with Lee for nearly 2 years, later recalled the sensation. It was like the air got heavier. Not hostile, exactly, just expectant. Everyone was watching without watching. The bodybuilders, for their part, adopted a studied casualness. They loaded bars with deliberate slowness, letting the plates clank a fraction louder than necessary. Conversations about protein shakes and contest prep continued, but the subject always circled back. Someone would ask, seemingly at random, "You think he's really that fast?" Another would answer, "Fast don't move 300 pounds." The replies were never heated. They were calm, almost philosophical. The way men discuss weather patterns they know will arrive eventually. A few neutral. Parties. Older judoka who trained in the early mornings. A couple of boxers who rented the ring on Tuesdays. Began showing up on afternoons they had never frequented before. They offered no opinion. They simply positioned themselves where they could observe without committing to a side. One of them, a 50-ish man named Hiroshi, who had run a small judo club in Beacon Hill since the late 1950s, later said he came because curiosity is heavier than pride. Small incidents began to accumulate, each one minor, yet amplifying the tension like pressure on a fault line. One Thursday, a young bodybuilder, new to the gym, still carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had only recently discovered iron, approached Lee directly after a footwork session. He was perhaps 6'2", 220 pounds, still carrying some adolescent softness around the middle. He extended a hand. "I've seen your stuff. Man, looks impressive. You ever spar?" Lee accepted the handshake, brief and firm. Sparring is for learning, not proving. The kid grinned. "Yeah, but sometimes you gotta prove it anyway, right?" Lee regarded him for a moment, expression neutral. "Sometimes." The kid walked away, satisfied, as though he had scored a point. Within the hour the story had traveled. The new guy had called out Lee and gotten nothing but philosophy in return. To some it sounded like evasion. To others it sounded like restraint. Another afternoon, Jim was doing incline dumbbell presses, 100-pounders, slow negatives, when one of Lee's students accidentally kicked a water bottle across the boundary between mat and weights. The bottle rolled to a stop near Jim's feet. He picked it up without pausing his set, finished the rep, then lobbed it gently back toward the mats. No words, no glare, just a small, precise gesture that carried the message. The line still existed, but it could be crossed. Lee was not present that day. When his students recounted the moment later, they did not embellish. They simply noted that Jim had handled the intrusion with the same calm economy he applied to everything else. By the last week of April, the anticipation had settled into something almost ritualistic. People began arriving earlier, claiming spots along the wall or near the heavy bags that gave the clearest view of the mat. No one openly gathered in a circle. That would have been too obvious, too much like a spectacle. Instead, they positioned themselves in ones and twos, pretending to stretch, adjust weights, wipe down equipment. The pretense was thin, but it preserved a necessary fiction. This was still just another day at the gym. Lee continued to arrive, in the same unhurried way. Sweatshirt, cotton pants, small canvas bag over one shoulder. He greeted the few people he knew by name, bowed slightly, then went directly to his work. If he felt the weight of the eyes on him, he gave no indication. His drills remained the same. Wing Chun forms practice at half. Speed, then full speed. Wooden dummy work when the dummy was free. Occasional one-on-one coaching. The only change was that he now finished sessions a little earlier, as though preserving energy for something unspoken. Jim, meanwhile, adjusted his own schedule without announcement. He began training in the same late afternoon window Lee used. shifting from his usual early evening slot. His workouts grew slightly shorter, more explosive, fewer sets, heavier loads, longer rest between. He was not bulking anymore. He was sharpening. The whispers reached their quiet peak one rainy Friday when a quiet carpenter named Ray, who had trained karate for 8 years before switching to weights, leaned toward his training partner and said, almost under his breath, "It's gonna happen soon." The partner did not ask, "What?" He only nodded. No date had been set. No time had been agreed. Yet the gym had collectively decided that the collision was inevitable, that the only remaining question was when the silence would break into motion. Outside, the rain continued to fall in fine, relentless sheets. Inside, the air held its breath. It happened on a Tuesday in the first week of May. No one had circled a date on a calendar. No posters had been taped to the walls. Yet when the clock above the locker room door read 4:47 p.m., the gym felt as though it had been waiting for exactly that minute. The rain had paused for the first time in days, leaving the windows streaked and the air inside cooler, cleaner. Fewer people than usual were lifting, perhaps 15 regulars, scattered across the floor, but more bodies lined the perimeter than on any ordinary afternoon. They stood in loose, informal clusters, 2 or 3 near the heavy bags, a few leaning against a brick wall by the water fountain, others pretending to adjust cables on machines that did not need adjusting. No one spoke above a murmur. The only steady sounds were the occasional clank of a plate being racked and the soft shuffle of shoes on rubber mats. Lee arrived at 4:50, same as always. Plain gray sweatshirt, black cotton pants, canvas bag slung over one shoulder. He paused just inside the door, scanned the room without hurry, then walked straight to the mat area. He did not acknowledge the extra eyes on him. He simply dropped his bag, removed his shoes, and began as usual. Warm-up, slow arm circles, gentle neck rolls, then a sequence of standing, stretches that lengthen the spine and open the hips. His movements carried. No flourish, no preparation for spectacle. They were the same routine he had followed for years. Jim entered 3 minutes later. He wore a faded black tank top and gray sweatpants. The fabric stretched across shoulders and thighs that seemed carved from the same dense material as the iron he lifted. He carried nothing, no towel, no water bottle. He walked directly to the mat boundary, stopped, and stood with arms relaxed at his sides. The shift in atmosphere was immediate, but silent. Conversations stopped. Breathing patterns changed. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to. Steady. Lee finished his last stretch, turned and saw Jim. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. No nod, no bow, no spoken greeting. Lee simply stepped to the center of the mat and waited. Jim removed his shoes, placed them neatly beside the edge, and stepped onto the rubber. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who knows exactly how much space his body occupies. They stood facing each other, 8 feet apart. No gloves, no pads, no referee, no rules announced. The distance between them felt both vast and intimate. Jim spoke first, voice low and even, carrying just far enough for the room to hear. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to know if what they say is real." Lee answered without hesitation, tone calm, almost conversational. "Then let's find out." No more words followed. Jim advanced in a single, measured step, not a rush, not a lunge, but a deliberate closing of distance. His arms hung loose, ready to grab or strike. At 6'4" and 320 pounds, the step carried momentum that should have forced retreat or collision. Most men would have given ground. Lee did not. Instead, he shifted, fractionally, laterally, no more than 6 inches. The movement looked small from the sidelines, almost casual, yet placed him outside the direct line of Jim's advance while keeping him within reach. Jim adjusted instantly, pivoting to face him again, this time leading with his right hand in a slow, testing grab, toward Lee's shoulder. The motion was not violent. It was exploratory, the way a man might reach to confirm something solid exists. Lee's response was immediate and economical. His left hand rose in a soft arc, contacting the inside of Jim's wrist, not a hard block, but a glancing redirection. The contact lasted less than a quarter second. Jim's arm continued its path, but now it carried slightly outward, off balance by perhaps 10 degrees. Lee stepped forward into the created space, his right hand sliding along the same line, palm open, fingers relaxed. He struck, not with a fist, but with the heel of his hand, directly to the center of Jim's chest, just below the sternum. The sound was not loud. A soft thump, like a heavy book dropped on carpet. Jim's body reacted before his mind could register. His knees buckled inward, his shoulders rounded forward. His breath left in a sharp, involuntary exhale. He did not fly backward. He simply folded, dropping straight down to one knee, then both hands instinctively coming to his chest as though to contain something that had already escaped. His face registered no pain at first, only surprise, then a slow dawning of comprehension. The entire sequence, from first step to collapse, took less than 8 seconds. The gym held its silence. No gasps, no shouts, only the faint buzz of the lights and the distant drip of a faucet somewhere in the locker room. Lee stepped back one, measured pace. He did not raise his hands in victory. He did not speak. He simply stood, breathing evenly, watching. Jim remained on his knees for perhaps 10 seconds longer. Then, slowly, he placed both palms on the mat and pushed himself upright. His movements were careful, almost reverent. When he reached his full height again, he did not meet Lee's eyes immediately. He looked instead at the place on the mat where he had knelt as though studying evidence. Finally he raised his head. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. I felt it, right here. He tapped 2 fingers against his solar plexus. Like the floor moved, Lee inclined his head, slightly, the smallest acknowledgement. Jim exhaled once, long and slow. Then he turned, walked to the edge of the mat, retrieved his shoes, and stepped off without another word. He did not rush. He did not slump. He simply left the area the way he had entered it, deliberate, composed, changed. Lee remained standing in the center for another moment. Then he bowed, once shallow, toward the empty space where Jim had stood, turned, collected his bag, slipped his shoes back on, and walked toward the door. The observers did not applaud. They did not rush forward. They simply watched him leave, then began to disperse in ones and twos, returning to benches and bars as though waking from the same quiet dream. Some lifted again that afternoon. Some left early. None spoke of what they had seen until much later, and when they did, the accounts were sparse, factual, almost reverent. The moment had not been loud. It had not been prolonged. It had been precise, inevitable, and brief, exactly as Lee had always maintained that true power should be. The gym did not erupt after Jim rose from the mat. No one clapped. No one shouted questions across the room. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum. The rain, which had returned during the encounter, tapped quietly against the windows as though nothing of significance had occurred. Yet everything had changed, and the change lived in the silence that followed rather than in any dramatic aftermath. Jim walked to the locker, room without haste. His steps were measured, the same deliberate cadence he had always used, but something in the rhythm had softened. He did not glance back toward the mat. He did not seek out anyone's eyes for confirmation or sympathy. He simply moved through the space he had always occupied, past the benches, where men now pretended to adjust weights they had already set, past the water fountain where droplets still hung from the spout. Inside the locker room, the air was warmer, thicker with steam from the showers that someone had left. Running, Jim sat on the narrow wooden bench that ran the length of the row of lockers. He rested his elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, and stared at the concrete floor for a long minute. His chest still rose and fell a little, faster than normal, though the sharp ache beneath his sternum had already begun to fade into a dull, diffuse pressure, not injury, exactly, but the memory of force meeting structure that refused to yield. 2 other regulars were changing nearby, a powerlifter named Tom who spotted Jim on heavy benches, and a younger man, Dave, who had only been coming to the gym for 6 months. Neither spoke at first. Tom finally broke the quiet. "You all right?" Jim nodded once, without looking up. "Yeah." Another stretch of silence. Dave, pulling on his street shoes, ventured the question everyone else was holding. "What happened out there?" Jim exhaled through his nose, a sound that was almost a short laugh without humor. "He hit me once. I went down. That's what happened." Tom closed his locker door softly. "You rushed him?" "No. I stepped in. He moved. I grabbed at his shoulder. He turned it, stepped inside, and Jim touched 2 fingers to the center of his chest again, the same gesture he had made on the mat. "Right here." Like someone turned the lights off for a second. Dave sat down on the opposite bench, elbows on knees, mirroring Jim's posture without realizing it. "Did it hurt?" "Not like a punch. More like the air got pulled out. Couldn't breathe for a couple seconds. Legs just decided they were done." Tom leaned against the lockers. "You can go back at him?" Jim considered the question longer than the others expected. When he answered, his voice carried no heat, only a kind of weary clarity. "No point. I felt what I needed to feel." He stood then, opened his locker, and began changing into dry clothes. The conversation did not continue. The 3 men finished dressing in the same quiet rhythm they had maintained for years, but the silence between them had acquired weight. Outside, on the mat, Lee had already left. His students remained for another 20 minutes, some stretching, some talking in low voices, but none of them replayed the moment in loud reenactment. Mark, the university student who had trained with Lee longest, later described their reaction. "We didn't cheer. We didn't need to. It wasn't a win in the way people usually mean. It was proof. That was enough." The following days brought the first visible ripples. Jim returned to the gym. The next afternoon, same time as always. He did not avoid the mat area. He sat up in his usual rack, loaded his bar, and worked through squats, slightly lighter than his peak sets, but with perfect form. When he finished, he wiped down the equipment, as he always did, then walked past the mats without stopping. A few heads turned. No one spoke to him about it. No one needed to. His presence there, continuing without drama, carried its own statement. The question had been answered, and life continued. Over the next weeks, small behavioral shifts appeared among the regulars. A bodybuilder who had once dismissed that kung fu stuff, as theater began asking one of Lee's students, quietly between sets, how the trapping hands actually worked. He did not sign up for classes. He simply listened. The young lifter who had shaken Lee's hand weeks earlier stopped trying to bait anyone into demonstrations. He began practicing basic stance work in the corner during slow hours, poorly at first, but persistently. Even Hiroshi, the old judoka, changed his routine. He started arriving on Tuesdays and Thursdays. During Lee's training window, he never crossed onto the mat. He simply watched from the wall, arms folded, studying footwork and structure where a craftsman studies another man's tools. Jim himself did not speak publicly about the encounter for more than a year. When he finally mentioned it, casually, over coffee with Tom and 2 others, it was not to boast or complain. "I thought size was the final argument," he said. "Turns out it's only one of the arguments, and not always the strongest one." He did not frame it as defeat. He framed it as data. The distinction mattered to him. Lee, for his part, never referred to the incident in class. He continued teaching the same way. Precise, corrections, minimal explanation, maximum demonstration through movement rather than words. If students asked about it directly, he answered briefly. It was necessary, he would say. Now it's finished. Yet his drills grew subtly sharper in the months that followed. Not more aggressive, never that, but more refined, as though the encounter had confirmed something he had always known and now no longer needed to question. The psychological shift was the deepest and the quietest. Men who had measured worth in pounds and inches began, slowly, unevenly, to consider other metrics, timing, position, intent. The collapse had not been physical so much as conceptual. A 320-pound frame had been moved not by superior mass, but by superior understanding of how bodies actually function in space. That realization lingered longer than any bruise could have. In the locker room, on the benches, in the parking lot after dark, the story began to be told in fragments, not as legend yet, but as shared memory, each retelling stripped away exaggeration until only the essential remained. One step, one redirection, one strike, 8 seconds silence. The lesson did not need to be spoken aloud. It lived in the way men now watched Lee move across the mat, in the way they measure their own lifts against something less tangible than weight on a bar, and the way Jim, still massive, still strong, carried himself with a new, unspoken deference toward precision. The echo was not loud. It was persistent. Chapter 6, Shadows of Legacy. The brick building on. East Union Street still stands, though the gym inside has changed hands twice since the middle 1970s. The rubber mats were replaced in 1982, the fluorescent lights upgraded to something less harsh in the late 1990s. The power racks remain scarred by the same chalk marks and rust spots that were already there when Jim loaded his last heavy set. New faces lift there now, men and women born after the event itself, but the story has never fully left the walls. Jim continued training at the gym until 1978, when he moved to a smaller facility closer to his home in West Seattle. He never competed again after 1974, not because he lost confidence, but because the questions he once asked of his body had quieter answers now. He took up coaching informally, showing younger lifters how to brace properly, how to breathe under load, how to recognize when ego outweighed physics. When someone asked him about that time with the Chinese guy, he answered the same way every time. Brief, factual, without drama. I learned something, he would say, still using it. He died in 2009 quietly of heart complications unrelated to lifting. At his memorial, a handful of the old regulars gathered. One of them, Tom, the spotter from the locker room, afternoons, placed a small photograph on the table beside the urn. Jim at 33, mid-set on the bench press, veins standing out on forearms the size of most men's calves. No one mentioned the mat incident in the speeches. They did not need to. The men who had been there understood that the photograph carried both halves of the story, the mass that once defined him and the moment that redefined how he measured strength afterward. Lee left Seattle more permanently in 1971, though he returned for brief visits until 1972. His teaching in the city had always been selective. Small groups, private lessons, no large academies. When he moved south to Oakland and then Los Angeles, the core of what he left behind traveled with his students. Mark, the lanky university student, opened a small Wing Chun school in Fremont in 1974. He never advertised it as Bruce Lee's method. He simply taught the same drills. Trapping hands, centerline theory, economy of motion. Over the years, a few of Jim's former lifting partners showed up at his door, not a challenge, but to learn. They came alone, usually after dark, and left without fanfare. Mark never turned them away. The story itself began. to circulate beyond the gym walls in the late 1970s, carried first by word of mouth among Pacific Northwest martial artists, then in scattered letters and phone calls to schools in California and Vancouver. It was never written as a formal account. No one filmed it. No newspaper ran a headline. It existed, instead, as a series of quiet retellings. There was this time in Seattle, followed by the essential details, always the same: one step, one redirection, one strike, under 10 seconds, silence afterward. The absence of exaggeration kept it credible. The lack of witnesses eager to embellish kept it pure. By the early 1980s, the account had reached a level of quiet legend within certain circles, not the wide, cinematic myth that would later attach to Lee after Enter the Dragon and his passing in 1973, but a more contained, almost private transmission among serious practitioners. Judo instructors in Tacoma mention it when debating the value of soft versus hard arts. Karate black belts in Bellevue used it as a cautionary reference when students asked why kata mattered more than sparring. Even some powerlifters, in the privacy of late-night garage sessions, would nod when a name came up. Yeah, I heard about that. Guy was huge. Didn't matter. What endured was not a tale of victory, but a demonstration of hierarchy, not of size over skill or skill over size, but of understanding over assumption. The event became a kind of parable told without moralizing. When structure meets mass without preparation, structure prevails if it is true. Men who had spent years chasing bigger numbers on the bar began, in small ways, to value position and timing. Alongside them, training evolved subtly, more emphasis on breath control, more attention to centerline, more willingness to concede that a smaller man, moving correctly, could render size momentarily irrelevant. In the decades since, the gym on East Union has seen generations pass through. Some heard the story from fathers or uncles who lifted there in the 70s. Others stumbled across fragments in old martial arts forums or yellowed letters tucked into training manuals. The details remain sparse and consistent. No one claims to have seen a knockout. No one describes flying bodies or shattered boards. They describe a moment of stillness that ended in stillness, a redirection so clean it looked inevitable only in retrospect. Today, if you walk into the gym on a rainy afternoon, you might see a young instructor running a small class in the corner where the mats used to be. He teaches a blend of arts, none of them labeled with a single name. His students are diverse: office workers, students, a few former athletes. They drill footwork and structure with the same quiet focus Lee once demanded. Sometimes, when the room is empty except for the hum of the lights, the instructor will pause and tell the story exactly as it was passed to him, briefly, without embellishment. The listeners do not cheer. They listen. Then they return to their drills. Outside, the rain falls, in the same fine sheets it always has. Inside, the echo continues, not loud, not triumphant, simply present. A reminder that true authority does not require volume. It requires only precision, restraint, and the patience to let events prove themselves.